Elias Vane moved into the dead end of Briar Street in late November, just as the trees had turned into black, skeletal things, and the sun seemed to give up before evening had properly begun. The house he chose had been empty for years, a narrow two-story place with peeling blue paint and a porch that leaned forward like it was trying to listen. No wife came with him, no children, no truck full of memories, just one dusty sedan, 6 cardboard boxes, a suitcase, and a face that looked as if sleep had stopped visiting him long ago. The neighbors noticed him because there was nothing else to notice on Briar Street. Mrs. Clancy from across the road watched through her lace curtains as he carried his things inside with mechanical patience. The Harpers next door whispered that he was either grieving or hiding. Teenagers passing on bikes dared each other to ride close to the gate and shout hello, but the man never answered. Within a week, a routine formed around him. Every morning at exactly 7, Elias stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, stood very still, and stared at the woods beyond the cul-de-sac as though waiting for someone to emerge. Then he went back inside and was not seen again until dusk, when one dim yellow lamp lit up the front room. No television flickered, no radio played, no visitors came. Even the delivery men left his packages at the gate and hurried away. What unsettled people was not that he lived alone, but how completely alone he seemed. The house made no ordinary sounds. No footsteps crossing from room to room. No plumbing groaning awake. No front door opening unexpectedly. It was a house occupied in theory more than in fact, as though Elias existed inside it the way a memory exists in an old photograph. Then winter deepened, and with it the first strange rumor. Mrs. Clancy claimed that one night, while taking out her trash after midnight, she heard voices drifting from Elias's upstairs window. Not one voice. Several. Low and urgent, overlapping in a way she could not make out, as if people were speaking in the next room with the door barely closed. The next morning she mentioned it to the Harpers, expecting a laugh, but instead Mr. Harper went pale and admitted he had heard something too the week before. What sounded like a child giggling behind the walls of Elias's house. By evening, Briar Street had become a street of listeners. Curtains twitched, porch lights stayed on later. Everyone watched the lonely house at the end of the road, and everyone told themselves the same reassuring lie. There had to be a simple explanation. They still believed that then. They still thought walls could not remember, and silence could not lie. The voices returned 3 nights later, louder this time, and impossible to explain away. Rain had swept over Briar Street in gray sheets, and the wind had stripped the last leaves from the trees, sending them skittering across the asphalt like frightened animals. Around 10 o'clock, the Harpers were in their kitchen when they heard a woman's voice rise sharply from Elias's house. It was not a scream. It was worse. It was the sound of someone arguing with desperate restraint, like a person trying not to wake a sleeping child while terror climbed into her throat. Mr. Harper stepped onto his porch and saw porch lights switching on all down the street. Faces appeared in windows. Mrs. Clancy opened her front door, robe clutched at the neck, and shouted through the rain, "Do you hear that?" Then came another voice, deeper, angry, followed by the unmistakable slam of something heavy against a wall. A dog began barking 3 houses away and would not stop. Yet no lights shone in Elias's upper windows. No shadows moved behind the curtains. The house remained dark except for the familiar lamp in the front room downstairs, burning with that same still, patient glow. After a minute, the voices stopped so suddenly that the quiet itself felt violent. Mr. Harper, acting partly from concern and partly because fear becomes unbearable when no one moves, crossed the street and knocked on Elias's door. No answer. He knocked again, harder. At last the door opened a narrow inch, and Elias stood there with one hand on the frame. His expression flat, but his eyes wild in a way that made Harper step back without meaning to. "Everything all right?" Harper asked. Elias looked over his shoulder into the darkness behind him before answering. "Yes." His voice was dry, used too little. Harper hesitated. People heard shouting. A tiny pulse jumped in Elias's jaw. "You heard the house," he said. Then he closed the door. Not slammed, closed carefully, like he was afraid of disturbing something on the other side. The next day, the story spread beyond Briar Street. By noon, people walking dogs paused at the end of the cul-de-sac to stare. By evening, someone had posted on the neighborhood forum asking whether the police should perform a wellness check. Some argued it could be domestic violence, except no one had ever seen anyone else enter or leave. Others said maybe Elias had family staying with him in secret, but those who lived nearest knew better. They knew the rhythm of that house now. They knew its stillness, and that was what made the sounds unbearable. Because when the voices came, they did not sound like guests. They sounded like people who belonged there, people who had every right to speak from inside those walls. People who had been waiting to be how Officer Rene Salgado came the following afternoon, more to calm the neighborhood than out of any real suspicion. He was a practical man with broad shoulders and a tired face, the kind who believed that most mysteries were simply untidy facts in disguise. Several residents watched from their windows as he approached the house and knocked. This time, Elias answered immediately, as if he had been standing behind the door waiting. Salgado spoke with him on the porch for several minutes, then asked if he could come in. Elias hesitated long enough for every curtain on the street to tighten with interest, but finally, he stepped aside. The officer entered. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When Salgado emerged, he looked composed, but not in the easy, dismissive way the neighbors had hoped for. He told them there was no sign of anyone else in the home, no hidden rooms, no evidence of disturbance. The upstairs was sparsely furnished, and several rooms were empty altogether. Probably old pipes, wind in the framing, acoustics, he said. Yet his voice lacked conviction, and Mrs. Clancy noticed he kept rubbing his wedding ring with his thumb. Later that evening, after dark had thickened over the cul-de-sac, Salgado returned alone in his patrol car and parked without lights at the corner. He stayed there nearly an hour, at 11:17 p.m. According to the timestamp on Mrs. Clancy's security camera, he got out and stood by the sidewalk facing Elias's house. Nothing moved. The lamp downstairs glowed faintly. Then, at 11:23, Salgado slowly raised his head toward the second floor. On the camera audio, faint but clear, a child's voice can be heard saying, "He won't let us leave." Salgado froze. Then another voice joined it, a woman, trembling, pleading, "Please, please open the door." The officer ran to the porch and pounded so hard the whole frame shuddered. Elias opened, but before Salgado could speak, the voices stopped. Witnesses later said the two men stared at each other for several seconds like strangers meeting at the edge of a cliff. Salgado pushed past him and searched the house again, faster this time, opening closets, pulling shower curtains aside, checking under beds where no child could possibly hide. He found nothing. When he reached the upstairs hallway, however, he stopped at the last door on the left. It was locked from the outside with a brass slide bolt that looked older than the house itself. "What's in there?" he asked. Elias answered from behind him, "Nothing now." Salgado drew back the bolt and opened the door. The room beyond was empty except for dust, bare floorboards, and claw marks carved deep into the wood near the far wall, as though someone had once tried to dig their way out with bleeding hands. That was the moment Briar Street stopped treating Elias Vane as an odd recluse and began to fear him. Because empty rooms do not beg for help. Empty houses do not whisper in children's voices. And men with nothing to hide do not lock doors to rooms that contain only the marks of someone else's terror. By morning, Briar Street had divided into two camps, those who wanted Elias gone and those who wanted answers first. The police could not arrest a man for being strange, and claw marks, while disturbing, were not proof of a crime on their own. Records showed the house had once belonged to a family named Belrose nearly 20 years earlier, a mother, a father, and a daughter called Wren. After that, the paper trail thinned into rumor, a house fire that never fully caught, a missing persons report later withdrawn, then years of vacancy sealed under bank notices, legal disputes, and neglect. The more the neighbors learned, the less they understood. Elias, meanwhile, stopped pretending at routine. He no longer came to the porch at 7. The lamp stayed on day and night. Sometimes people saw him standing at the upstairs window of the locked room, though when they looked carefully, the room appeared empty again. Children were forbidden from biking near the cul-de-sac. Deliveries ceased. Even the mail carrier began leaving letters in a rubber-banded stack at the curb. On the 4th night after Salgado's search, a storm rolled in from the hills, bringing thunder that rattled windows and a darkness so deep it erased the line of the woods entirely. It was close to midnight when the whole street woke to the sound of pounding. Not on Elias's front door, on the inside of his walls. The noise shook through the rain in frantic, uneven bursts, followed by voices layered so thickly they became a human swarm, crying, pleading, arguing, a child counting in a sing-song whisper, a man repeating, "Not again! Not again! Not again!" Porch lights flared up and doors cracked open. Then, from the second floor of Elias's house, a lamp snapped on behind the window of the locked room. For the first time, everyone saw silhouettes. 3 of them. A tall man, a woman with one arm raised, a smaller figure standing between them. The shapes moved in jerks, as if acting out some terrible argument behind frosted glass. Mrs. Clancy began praying out loud. Mr. Harper called the police with shaking hands. Then the smallest silhouette turned toward the window and pressed both hands flat against it. A little girl's voice rang across the storm with impossible clarity. "He buried us in the walls." The window shattered outward, but nothing came through except rain and darkness. When officers arrived, they found the front door open and Elias waiting in the hallway, as though surrender had always been inevitable. He was not panicked. He looked exhausted, almost relieved. "I tried to keep them quiet," he told Salgado, who had returned with backup. "I thought if I stayed, they'd only speak to me." "Who?" Salgado asked. Elias turned his eyes toward the stairs. "The ones who remember." It is one thing to hear madness in a rumor, another to hear it spoken gently by a man who no longer fears being disbelieved. What Elias said next would later be repeated so many times it took on the shape of folklore. But the first people who heard it never forgot the way his voice sounded. Steady, ashamed, and far too sane. He told them he had not chosen the house by accident. 21 years earlier, his name had not been Elias Vane. It had been Daniel Belrose. He had been 9 years old, and this had been his home. His father, a carpenter with a temper that moved like weather, had become convinced that voices lived in the walls. Voices that mocked him, watched him, poisoned his wife against him. At first, everyone dismissed it as drink and grief after the loss of a second child. Then bruises appeared on Daniel's mother. Then locks. Then the rule that no one was to leave the house after sunset because they get stronger when strangers know where we are. Daniel remembered his mother whispering plans to run. He remembered his father nailing blankets over windows and talking to empty corners. He remembered Wren, his little sister, hiding in the hallway cupboard when the shouting began. One winter night, the father sealed the family into the upstairs room, claiming it was the only place the voices could not reach. But fear, once fed long enough, develops its own hunger. He accused Daniel's mother of inviting the voices in. He accused the children of answering them back. The argument turned violent. Daniel escaped when the bolt split and the door sprang loose. But his mother pushed him into the hallway and screamed for him to run before the man could catch him. Daniel fled into the woods behind Briar Street and hid there until dawn, cold and shaking, listening to the house moan in the dark. When police found him, he could barely speak. By the time they entered the house, the father was gone. So were the mother and Wren. The case collapsed into confusion and incompetence. Blood was found, but not enough. Fire damage in a back room obscured evidence. The father's truck surfaced months later in a river 2 counties away, empty, with no bodies and a traumatized child giving fractured statements about whispers in the walls. The county chose the version easiest to file away. Domestic violence, probable murder, probable suicide, child survivor relocated. Daniel was taken by relatives, renamed after an adoption, and spent the rest of his life trying not to remember. Until the dreams started, then the voices, then the certainty that the house was not haunted by strangers, but by memory itself, memory trapped in timber, nails, plaster, and silence. He came back not because he was brave, but because guilt had ripened into something heavier. "I ran," he said, standing in that narrow hallway as officers listened and rainwater seeped beneath the threshold. "I was 9, and I still ran. Every year I heard them a little clearer. My mother, Wren, even him. Like the house was waiting for me to come back and hear the rest." Salgado asked the only question that mattered. "The rest of what?" Elias Daniel looked toward the locked room upstairs and answered, "Where he put them." The search that followed lasted until morning. Walls were opened first in the upstairs room, then along the hallway, then in the narrow cavity behind the staircase where old blueprints suggested dead space had once existed. At 3:42 a.m., one of the officers struck something beneath the plaster that did not sound like beam or pipe. Work stopped. The section was cut carefully away. Behind it lay a void, barely 3 feet wide, hidden by a false frame built with the skill of a master carpenter. Inside were scraps of fabric, a rusted child's hair clip, and bones. Small bones first. Then more behind them, folded into darkness in ways no living body could manage. When dawn came gray and thin over Briar Street, the whole street knew before anyone was officially told. Forensics later confirmed 2 sets of remains hidden within the structure, an adult woman and a young girl. Deeper in the crawl space beneath the kitchen, workers uncovered a 3rd partial skeleton with damage to the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. The father had never fled. In the frenzy of his final night, after killing his wife and daughter and concealing them in the walls, he had died in the house as well, either by injury or drunken collapse, his body sliding into the unfinished cavity beneath the floor during a failed attempt to burn the evidence. The fire had guttered out, the house had kept its dead, and the dead, it seemed, had kept speaking. News crews came, investigators came, psychics came too, because where grief becomes public, spectacle follows. But the people of Briar Street remembered something the cameras could not quite capture. The voices stopped the moment the bones were carried out. Not faded, stopped. The house, once tense with listening, seemed to exhale. In the weeks that followed, Elias disappeared from public view, except for one morning when Mrs. Clancy saw him standing alone on the porch in clear daylight. No coffee mug in hand this time, no fixed stare toward the woods. He looked smaller somehow, as though the thing that had occupied most of his life had finally released its grip and left him with the ordinary weight of being a man in the world. He noticed her watching and gave the faintest nod before turning back toward the open door. The house was sold a year later and torn down 2 months after that. Families still tell the story on Briar Street whenever storms roll in and old homes creak after midnight. They tell of the man who lived alone in the blue house at the dead end, the man neighbors feared until they learned he had been sharing those rooms with the unfinished voices of the people he had lost. But the part that lingers, the part that keeps the story alive, is not the horror of bones in plaster or a child's ghost at the window. It is the terrible mercy buried inside it, that some houses do not want blood and some ghosts do not want revenge. Some only want the truth carried out into the light. And sometimes the loneliest man on the street is not hiding from the world at all. Sometimes he is standing guard over the dead until someone finally believes them.